Hello everyone, and a big welcome to R J Sanderson TV. Again, Dave Kennedy's my name, and we've got a big show coming up for you. Leah Calnan, the President of the REIV, to join us, and another special guest to talk to us a little bit more about wellbeing. Roy Sanderson's here, as always, and Roy, we've got plenty to go through today, but we start with the situation in Victoria that is fast sort of spiralling out of control at the moment. How are you feeling as a business owner and as a business leader?
It's developing as we speak. The last few days have been a lot of turmoil in the city with protests, whether they're anti-vaxxers or pro-choice or one or the other. But certainly it's not a safe environment right at the moment.
You mentioned the sort of pro-choice, anti-vax, and that's sort of come to a head at the moment through the construction industry. You obviously look after a lot of tradie clients and construction industry clients. Obviously, you're probably starting to prepare for an inundation of questions. What have some of the questions been regarding support for that industry that probably is going to be sitting on the sidelines for the next couple of weeks?
Well, I think like a lot of people, if they've got no income coming in, then they need to look at having the disaster payment application, which is done on their MyGov account. But you're only eligible for that if your hours are reduced, and in this case that's a tick. But if you've got no holiday pay or sick leave accrued to you. So it's only if you can't get paid can you then get the government support.
Last month on R J Sanderson TV, we spoke with Paul Guerra, the Chief Executive of the Victorian Chamber of Commerce and Industry, and we talked about vaccination becoming a really difficult topic for businesses and governments to manage. You can see that there's going to be a lot of work that needs to be done in terms of putting in policy that regulates this space. Otherwise, you can see already that there's a potential, there's going to be groups of society that are going to push back on this, and businesses are going to have to work through that.
It's very difficult. At the moment, it's not law, but if it becomes law to be vaccinated, then those people who are pro-choice have to decide, do I follow my heart and insist on pro-choice, or do I follow the law? I will say there's plenty of laws I'm not happy about, but I have to obey them. There's many taxation laws in there as well. So it'll be interesting to see what happens from a government perspective, as long as business and individuals have clear direction and guidelines.
All right, well, let's get into some of the economic indicators through our news headlines today, Roy, because there's plenty of graphs that we want to talk to today and go through. And we start with GDP growth rate, which is still in the positive territory, but you can see that the trend there is certainly down, and GDP growth at 0.7% for Q4 2021 financial year.
The concerning thing here is the trend. And I'll be very surprised if it's positive next quarter, because that trend, after we jumped out of lockdown last time, bounced out of it very, very well. The trend now is down, and I think that is a real concern because there's not as much money in the economy right now like there was when we had JobKeeper.
One of the things that is driving that downward GDP growth rate, according to the Reserve Bank, is that household consumption reduces. Now, Roy, an interesting note here that they suggest that from their estimates and from their experience of lockdowns, that household consumption reduces about 15% during a lockdown. Now, we see that most of the Victorian and New South Wales population are in lockdown at various times throughout the last quarter. So as a result, household consumption goes down and household net savings rate goes up. And you can see that big spike from last year where the savings rate goes through the roof.
And this is where I've said that we don't have as much money in the economy right now. We don't have the JobKeeper, so I don't expect it to spike up nearly as much as it did when JobKeeper was around, because the benefits right now, the disaster payments, are a lot less what they were some time ago.
I think there's an interesting message there as well that, for people out there who think that, they've got a little bit of extra money, just remember that the houses next door are, they're putting a bit away and the household saving rate is going up. So there's probably a message there. Don't get lulled into a false sense of security that you can spend more money than you would ordinarily, because ultimately the economy works through relativity, and prices are going to go up. So relative to everyone, if you're not saving at the same rate as your neighbour, then potentially you're going to be paying more of your distribution for goods and services when the price increases. And we're going to talk to Leah Calnan about house prices, and we've seen, you know, massive increases in house prices over the past period of time. Potentially that could be driven by the increase in household saving from 2020.
Very well could be, as we believe it was last time when house prices spiked. And Leah from REIV will be great to see what she's got to say.
It could be the last time, Roy, that I put this graph up to talk about, because the unemployment rate is fast losing relevance in this current society of lockdowns and restrictions. But for governments, it's still an opportunity to trumpet an exciting narrative that the unemployment rate is at historically low levels. We're seeing that the jobless rate is at the lowest level since November 2008, and that all of these sort of major milestones are being achieved. But I think what is somewhat being lost on the discussion around unemployment rate in some discussion circles is that the unemployment rate is made up of a number of metrics, and if we have a look at some of these metrics, you can see there you'll be able to see on the next slide that the unemployment rate's actually made up of the number of employed people, the number of people who participate in actively seeking employment, which is called the participation rate, and of course the number of actually unemployed people. But so mathematically, if the number of employed people and the participation rate drop proportionately faster than the number of unemployed people increases, well then we're going to see a decrease in that number.
Yeah, I think this would shock a lot of people who are at home right at the moment. They can't work, or they're working significantly reduced hours, but they're not counted as unemployed or on the unemployment rate. Yeah,
as you say, you can see there the employed people at 13 million and 22,000. Of them, there are a number of people who are casually employed and working 0 hours, as an example, which is hospitality workers, or which is, in this instance, in some instances, it's going to be tradies over the next couple of weeks. So that number's perhaps not a true representation, and the number of hours the number of hours that have been worked collectively by the labour force has dropped. So you can see monthly hours worked in all jobs has decreased by 66 million in the month of August. So it's a lot of hours less than was worked in July. Roy, the other part of that is underemployment, and we've got a graph on that, and that's the number of people who are in employment but would like to work more hours, and that's on the increase as well.
And this is not surprising because people are being underemployed, where you have restrictions on cafes and restaurants on the number of people that they can serve. So those people are working less hours, or less people are working. And the same in the construction sector, even before the last 48 hours of announcements, where certain jobs, construction sites, were only allowed to have certain capacities, like 25% at one time, 50% at another time. That means that some people have to sit at home.
Mm. The other thing that affects employment, as we mentioned, was within the participation rate, is actually the number of people that are available in a population. And there's been some extraordinary changes to the population within Australia and within the States over the last few years over the last year with regards to the pandemic. And you can see here that there's been a negative population growth annually in Victoria to the tune of 43,000 people.
This is an extraordinary stat that Victoria needs to be worried about in a big time. What happens if we have lower population or negative population growth? What happens to our economy? It shrinks. What happens to our house prices? It shrinks. So this is a real concern, and probably one of the biggest concerns, having such negative or reduction in our population.
I think, yeah, as you said, the concern there for house prices is a really interesting point, and we'll talk more to the President of the Real Estate Institute of Victoria, Leah Calnan, very shortly on R J Sanderson TV. Right, Roy, consumer confidence. We talk about it every month on R J Sanderson TV, and you and I are probably both scratching our head a little bit on this one. It's gone up.
It's gone up. I'm surprised it went up, but I think they have an explanation for it.
amid hopes that COVID-19 curbs would be eased soon following an acceleration in vaccination. Now, remember, this is a monthly number, so by soon they mean within the next month. I think that obviously the Victoria's roadmap was not announced before this number was collated. New South Wales roadmap, I'm not 100% sure it was announced, but there's clearly, both governments have announced that the lockdowns will continue for a little bit of time, at least another 6 or 7 weeks or something along those lines. So perhaps we might see a decrease in that number when the September numbers released in due course.
Yes, because I think the roadmaps, some concern with the roadmaps are the amount of time and the variables about what vaccination rates we might have estimated at certain times. So I will be surprised if that goes up. I think we're going to see that come down, and added to that is what's happened over the last few days with protests, and that's going to knock confidence around quite a bit.
And more generally, the closure of the construction business, you sort of think that it's a big employer of people, and those people would be part of the survey results, or would be part of the people surveyed to collate the results for consumer confidence for the next month. So we'll wait and see in that space. Business confidence, another graph that we look at regularly on this show, it's also up, but still well down on historical norms.
I think this is not surprising that we're still into a negative space and negative head space for business, and I actually think this will continue to get worse as well, what's happened in the last 48 hours also.
I think, yeah, as you say, largely it's the same set of factors that affect consumer confidence that are going to be affecting business confidence. It's the lack of clarity, but also the lack of alignment between different parts of society at the moment is going to create further strain on various industries and various businesses around the state. So it's a wash, that space. The inflation rate is something we've been keeping an eye on, Roy. We mentioned before that household net savings rate has gone up. So it means that there's more money that people are holding on to, and perhaps less money that's being spent. So, what does that mean? And we also heard that, household consumption's down 15% during lockdowns. What does that mean? Well, we've been watching the inflation rate. It's at 3.8%. And as we know, the inflation rate the inflation rate is usually linked to the amount of money in the economy. So what do you make of that one, Roy?
I think it's a little bit of a concern that the inflation rate has gone up, and I think it will continue to go up. I think there's going to be pressure on that to go up because I think a lot of things are actually increasing in price. And I'm surprised at how big that jump was, by the way. We haven't seen a jump that size for many quarters, could be years.
The Reserve Bank are usually tasked with managing inflation through monetary policy, and they effectively set interest rates, which has a massive effect on housing prices. And they had this to say in their latest statement on monetary policy, which is really interesting. More broadly, society-wide concerns about the level of housing prices are not best addressed through increasing interest rates and curbs on lending. What do you make of that, Roy? They are basically saying, sorry, the Reserve Bank, this is not our job, this is someone else's job.
This is extraordinary, absolutely extraordinary, because I would have always thought that the Reserve Bank's policy was to curb property prices. I'm sure in my lifetime I've seen it many times. So this is extraordinary. I can't get over it.
They go on to say the factors include the design of our taxation system and social security systems, planning and zoning. So effectively what they're saying is this is not a monetary policy exercise, this is a budgetary policy exercise, and it's up to governments to create legislation and policy that address increasing housing prices. So they're sort of just wiping their hands of it, Roy. It's not our problem.
It's not our problem is what they've said, which I don't agree with. I think it is their problem. I think it's a joint problem. And I think the Reserve Bank have always increased or lowered interest rates to try and curb prices of housing. It'll be very interesting to see what Leah has to say about that.
We know interest rates are at historical lows, and we know that the Reserve Bank has the intention to keep them that way, and the Federal Reserve in the US are the same. But it is going to be interesting if that inflation rate does creep up, because potentially they could change their stance on that. We've mentioned it a few times on the show today that we're very lucky to have a very special guest from the Real Estate Institute of Victoria. Leah Calnan's her name and she's the president. She joins us now on R J Sanderson TV. Welcome, Leah.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Leah, before we get into some of the more detailed questions, the Victorian Roadmap was announced on the weekend. What did you think about the details that were announced?
Oh, look, I think it is a great step forward. I think all businesses really and industries needed to see some direction, probably a little bit longer than we all had hoped for. We'd all like to see a lot more activity happening out in the industry and metro-wide, probably sooner than what's been penciled in.
Leah, we've had a fairly difficult 48 hours with protests and construction industry. What are your thoughts on the closure of the construction industry?
Look, it's really interesting because really for the last 18 months, the construction industry is almost seen to be untouchable. But I think it really does demonstrate that for some time now, and if we go back to this time last week, the government did put the construction industry on notice that they weren't COVID compliant, they weren't following all the necessary rules. So, again, I probably stress to all of our members and also our vendors and our owners and our tenants to making sure that everyone is compliant when running inspections because, if it can happen to the construction industry, it can happen to any of us.
How much of a focus has there been on that, Leah? We mentioned that on the show earlier that, there's basically a minefield ahead for businesses and for various industries. How much of your focus has been on compliance and building plans for compliance in the real estate industry?
Well, because it's an ever-changing situation at the moment, it's encouraging and making sure that all members and all officers are continually updating their COVID plans. So every time we go into another lockdown, we need to make sure that we're implementing the new processes. This has really taken us back to probably lockdown 2 or 3, where at the end of every inspection, we were wiping down properties and door handles and opening them up, making sure that we were doing everything we needed to do. But I think moving forward, there's a real minefield of who's going to be monitoring those who are non-vaccinated, single vaccinated and double vaccinated. Surely it can't be the responsibility of industry to be policing that. And that is certainly something that we're all concerned at the moment.
Leah, we have a wellbeing guru coming on the show shortly, but I'm curious about with lockdowns, how do you manage or monitor the mental well-being of people working in the industry, real estate agents and property managers and the like?
Yeah, look, that's really, really, really challenging space. I think often we forget that not only are people trying to work from home, they're homeschooling. I've got 3 teenagers, add that to the mix and trying to do everything within an 8-hour day. So the industry across the board lost about 30% of their property managers about this time last year. So we have been struggling to ensure that we've got enough people on the ground. We've seen the higher education due to come into effect in the real estate space at the end of this month. So wellbeing is certainly a huge challenge out there. And lockdowns don't help. Not having any clear direction from government has certainly created a higher level of challenge and angst and anxiety for not only members and real estate agents, but also the public.
I'm curious also with lockdown, the advancement of technology, Zoom, etc. What effect does that have with VCAT and what do you see there?
Yeah, look, VCAT's been a really interesting one because they took a long time to upgrade their phone system. They haven't quite got to Zoom hearings at the moment. They are in all sorts of resource trouble, to be frank. They're about 18 months behind with certain cases. A standard bond application where there's a dispute between the owner and the tenant. They're sitting at about 18 months. So to have a standard application for a non-payment of rent is sitting at about 10 weeks. So VCAT was severely under-resourced and they lost about 10% of their members, which they just haven't seemed to been able to recover from.
I'm curious with VCAT, what is most common? Is it the landlord taking the tenant to VCAT or is it the tenant taking the landlord to VCAT? Because we've seen a huge shift of responsibility to the landlords. So
Yeah, it's a great question.
Who takes who?
Yeah, yeah, it's probably still 50-50. Mold's been a really big issue throughout the lockdowns. People are more confined to obviously home. People are running heaters continually, not ventilating. So mold's been a really big factor for both owners, tenants and property managers. But overall, we're seeing there's still a large number of owners who are ending tenancies due to needing to put their property on the market for sale, whether they're capturing the current great market conditions or because they've had some challenging tenancy situations over the last 18 months. And also we're seeing the non-payment of rent still happening, and we've seen that rent relief program come back by the state government.
Leah, earlier in the show we talked about the Reserve Bank statement, which said that basically that interest rates and moderating house prices is not their responsibility, or not the responsibility of monetary policy. It's a budgetary policy issue. And we also saw earlier in the show that we're seeing some negative population growth in Victoria. How are these sort of factors affecting your outlook for the property market in Victoria at the moment?
Yeah, that data we saw come out last week, it's a really interesting one because it doesn't seem to reflect on the movement or the purchase of property that we've seen over the last 6 months. We've seen earlier in the year the median house price went above the $1 million for Metro Melbourne. And what's really interesting at the moment, whilst money is really cheap, we're really only selling to Victorians, Australians as such. We don't have borders open. We don't have any international travellers happening at the moment. So, in the new year, it will be really interesting to see once we've got more activity from outside of Australia, what happens to house prices, because it's probably more likely to go up than go down, I would anticipate.
So your expectation, your crystal ball, for those sitting on the fence right now, thinking, do I get into the property market? Is now the right time? And I will say to listeners, I always say it's always the right time. But from your perspective, Leah, property market you believe will still continue to increase?
Yeah, certainly everything is trending the same way. With this lockdown, we're seeing the same level of activity coming out as we saw this time last year. We saw a really, really strong market. It's certainly suggesting that if you want to get into the property market, you need to get in now. It would be amiss of me not to say that as a real estate agent as well. But I really do believe that the Victorian property market, both metro and regional, have performed so exceptionally well considering we've been in a pandemic.
Leah, you're on the board of the REIV. You're president, which sounds to me like a very busy life, and you're a mother and homeschooling, but also outside your REIV's responsibilities, what do you do? What do you have another role or full-time position anywhere?
What else do you want to do?
Look,
well, I did a little bit of a check, and you also have a business called Metro Property Management.
Yeah. Yes, I do. I have it feels like that's been my part-time business for the last 2 years. But we lease and manage properties right across Melbourne. We have about 2,000 properties under management, and so in between, clients and media and sometimes yelling at the children and trying to organise the menu for the week. It's been a crazy 2 years.
I can certainly imagine that, Leah. Thank you so much for giving up your time. We know that your time is very precious, as you've sort of indicated there, so really appreciate you joining us today on RJ Sanderson TV.
My pleasure.
Leah Calnan, the president there of the Real Estate Institute of Victoria. Roy, always a great joy to have Leah on the show with plenty of insights, so we thank her for her time.
Yep, thanks, Leah. That was awesome.
Roy, we've asked her all the questions. It's now time to turn our attention to you because it's time for question time, and the viewers have sent in a couple of doozies today. And we start with one that made our production team laugh when we saw this come through. I sold a rare Pokemon card for $13,000. If you don't mind, do I need to pay tax on it?
Well, it's interesting. A Pokemon card falls into the category of a personal use asset or a collectible. In actual fact, it's a collectible. If it was a personal use asset, which might be something like a boat or furniture, then it's you only pay tax on it if its value when you bought it was more than $10,000. But in this case, a Pokemon card is actually a collectible. And at the time it was acquired, it needs to be $500 or less. And if that's the case, then it is zero taxed. Now, I happen to know this person, and this person did say that it was free. She'd held it since she was at primary school, and she had actually bought a pack of cards, Pokemon cards, and had gone to school and swapped with somebody else, and she ended up with a very rare one that she's held on for something like 12 or 15 years, and has now sold it for $13,000. How good is that as a story? No tax on it at all. Zero tax.
We've just got a team of millennials and Gen Y people and Gen X people in the control room, just absolutely shattered that we didn't hold on to our Pokemon cards for longer. So there you go, no tax on that one. Next question, can I ask my boss to take extra tax out of each week's pay to get a bigger tax refund?
And the short answer is yes. We are not permitted to ask our boss to take less than the prescribed rate in tax, so we can't go below the threshold or the amount that must be deducted, but you can always ask for more, and it's a great way to get an extra refund. If you can cover or not be stressed cash flow wise from pay to pay and have an extra $20 per week taken out in tax, you'll get all that back at the end of the year. So it's a pretty good forced saving, another $1,000 that will be added to your refund. So yes, do it.
There you go. Before we get to Roy's rage, I want to talk to you about the ways that you relax, so that maybe you don't go as hard in Roy's rage. And Are You OK surveyed the CPA for their favourite ways to relax. Here's what they came up with, Roy.
Yes, I know. CPA Australia, thank you for this slide. Number one was exercise. I'm not surprised at that. Gardening, getting out to nature, some others. Reading, meditation. Number 8 is having a bath. But number 7, building an Excel spreadsheet. You have got to be joking. Accountants who CPAs, of which I'm one, I'm ashamed that you would prefer to build an Excel spreadsheet than have a bath. Get a life.
I don't think that'd make my top 100 ways to relax.
Mine either.
I don't know about that, Roy. I don't know. Maybe there's a little secret yearning for the Excel spreadsheet amongst the accountants community, but yeah, good fun there. All right, time to get into your rage. What's got you upset? What's got you worked up this week?
Well, my rage was going to be that we have a Victorian Grand Final holiday and we have no Grand Final in Victoria and we have no parade. But I realised I actually did that last year. So I was raged about that last year. So I had to come up with something a little different. So I've come up with this. We know that there was a hardship grant which started at $10,000 in Victoria. It was increased to $20,000 and it had an expiry date because lockdown was expected to cease. The expiry date was the 10th of September 2021. And that, if you didn't apply by that time, you miss out on the $20,000 grant. And you could only get the grant if your turnover was down 70% and you were GST registered. Well, we're still in lockdown. So, Mr. Premier, I think you should open that grant back up because there are businesses that are now down 70% and GST registered that might not have been down 70% by the 10th of September. So I'm calling on the Premier to open the grant up again for businesses to apply for this grant.
It's good to get that out of your system, Roy. And I know that sometimes those type of things get you worked up. But we've actually got a person that we're going to talk to now that may even help you to feel better in those moments of rage because he is a wellbeing specialist. He's a GP and he's the founder of Atomic Wellbeing. And I talk of Dr. G, and he joins us on R J Sanderson TV right now. Welcome, Dr. G.
Thank you, my friends. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. I'm super grateful.
Dr. G, tell us firstly a little bit more about what Atomic Wellbeing is and what your role is that you play at Atomic Wellbeing.
Yeah, so as you said, David, I'm a GP and I founded Atomic Wellbeing early last year, just before COVID hit. And it exists essentially as a way of showing our service to educators. We really care about educators and we want to essentially help them be healthier and happier. And during these times of in and out lockdowns, we've switched to this idea of helping them become what we call COVID proof. So this idea that educators can still maintain and thrive in terms of the health of their body and their minds, irrespective of what's happening in the outside world, particularly with lockdown. So their well-being and happiness does not rely on what is said at a press conference, for example. It's cultivated internally, and that's something that we're super passionate about. And particularly for myself, I'm super passionate about serving educators because I just think they're awesome. The more I spend time with them, the more I feel like I'm becoming a better version of myself. So it's an absolute privilege to be, I guess, part of the solution at least, and really give back to this education space.
We're going to talk a little bit more about the types of things that you talk to educators about and some of the strategies and techniques that you use with them. But tell us about how you got into that pathway. You mentioned that you've been going since just before COVID, and that you're a GP. You know, what sort of inspired you to open Atomic Wellbeing and to go down that path?
Yeah, that's a great question. For me, as a GP, it's a dream job, honestly, because you get to see everything, and that includes educators. I have a lot of teachers as patients, and a lot of the stuff that I was teaching them, particularly around mental health, it just clicked to me, what am I doing just doing it on one-on-one basis? Because I find if a teacher comes to see me, normally for everyone that comes to see me, maybe there's 10, 20 that don't. And normally by the time they're seeing me, there's something wrong, the cracks are already starting to show. But the actual treatment or the advice and the strategies that I give can be used preventatively as well. So that's why Atomic Wellbeing was essentially born, to essentially serve as something preventative, not just for physical health, but for mental health as well, or what I call happiness. So that's the idea. I always joke to my friends, my colleagues don't really appreciate this when I say this, but the idea for me is to try to put myself out of a job, because GPs see a lot of preventable diseases, and if we can stop them, if we can prevent them, then the GP work would look very different. But it would be really powerful, and it's much more powerful on me and our team going and serving a whole school full of educators as opposed to me seeing one teacher at a time in my consulting rooms.
Dr. G, how would that happiness skill look like for a primary school teacher, and could it be applied to a wider audience?
Absolutely. Happiness is a universal thing, and you framed the question beautifully, I must say, Roy. You said, how can the skill of happiness be implemented? And that's the first thing that I try to get across. Something I just wholeheartedly believe in is that I think we need to challenge the definition of happiness. So the classic definition of happiness is a positive emotional state characterized by feelings. So feelings such as joy, contentment, peace, fulfillment. And I want to challenge that and look at happiness as a skill. So a verb, an action, something that we ultimately do. And the reason we make that distinction, it's subtle, but it's profound. And it's had, honestly, changed my life. That simple adjustment has completely changed my life. And the reason it's changed my life is because if we look at happiness as a feeling, the feelings come and go, they're fleeting. But I refuse to accept that happiness can come and go. And my vision for my own life, and anyone who's willing to hear me rant about this, is that perhaps we can aim or prioritize happiness before, during, and after everything. And we can do that if we look at happiness as an action or something that we do. And of course, it's universal because, yes, educators are really struggling during this time, but so is everybody else. And if it's not COVID-19 or lockdown, it's something else. Life does not discriminate. There's always going to be challenges, and there's always going to be tough times. But building ourselves from inside out, I think, is really powerful, because if you really work on your mind and figure out how to use this as a strategy, we can all do it. It's just a matter of strategy and getting the strategy right and getting the systems right. It's really powerful because whatever comes, you'll have the tools that you need to get through it.
Dr. G, you talk about using happiness as a verb. For educators that are really struggling at the moment, who have had to who have had to roll out their classes virtually and face those type of challenges, and we know that, particularly for primary school educators, there's a lot of younger people who may live alone or not have big families that they can sort of bounce off emotionally. What's some of the advice that you give to those type of educators, and then also more broadly to other people who are in similar situations?
Great question, David. I'm going to answer that with a concept and then a specific strategy. So the first concept is putting your oxygen mask on first. So we've all heard it. We're on a plane, once upon a time when we were able to do that. We're on a plane, the oxygen mask comes down, and they always tell us, put our oxygen mask on first, then everybody else's. Always in that order. Ours first, then everybody else's. And what I've noticed in educators and pretty much all adults, especially if these adults have other responsibilities such as family and other commitments, the oxygen mask often goes outward first. Then if there's time, if you're lucky, they put it on for themselves. And I think that's backward. And the first thing that needs to happen is for a commitment to be made to put one's oxygen mask on first, or the happiness mask on first. And it's easier said than done, but in practice, I find that it's not common. And that getting that across is really powerful in itself. And in terms of a strategy, I think whatever strategy that people build into their life that is going to help with their well-being, help with their happiness, it needs to be built with the idea of, will this work in a worst case scenario? So when I work with educators, the biggest problem is time. They're just super busy, completely time poor, and they can't seem to fit anything in. So whatever they do, it needs to be able to fit under those circumstances. So whatever you try, it needs to be with that framework. So the first thing I would say is think of something that would give you the most bang for your buck. So for me, my happiness triad is meditation, gratitude, and exercise. So I know for me, that's where the money is. If I do that, I'm a pretty good version of myself. If I don't, not so much. So, and it depends on everyone's different. So you just got to find out what's going to give you your most bang for your buck, right? That's number one. And number two, you want to start and you want to make it very small. So people set happiness or well-being goals, and at face value, these goals seem great, but they set themselves up for failure. I'll give you an example. A common example is someone who wants to start exercising. They might say, I'm going to start walking. I want to really start walking for 30 minutes a day. And it sounds great, but for someone who's time poor, 30 minutes is a long time. It's adding on, the time it takes to prepare and the time after as well. So it's really powerful to take that big goal and what I call SRS, start ridiculously small, like frustratingly small. An example in my own life is I've been nursing a bit of a neck and calf injury from sports and martial arts. And the way I've been getting out of it and kept my habit of exercise, is through my oats. So every morning I'll put my oats on for 2 minutes. And in May, I just started with one push-up, SRS, right? Start ridiculously small. And I just did that for 3 weeks. Just one push-up, takes literally a second. But what I was doing is mastering the art of showing up to that habit. So James Clear in his book, Atomic Habits, talks about this perfectly. You sort of master the start of the habit, then you build the intensity. So since May, I mastered that first push-up, which was exercise, one of my happiness habits. And then I built the intensity. And since May, I've done over 1,500 push-ups, over 800 burpees, over 500 squats, over 2,000 calf raises, and it just slowly built. But the key was to build that start first and then the intensity. People go too early with the intensity and they haven't set up the right foundation yet. And the next step, if it hasn't been clear already, is consistency. It's just to do it for a long time. So even that one push-up done every day for a year, that's still 365 push-ups that I wouldn't have done. And it may not be my formal exercise as an example or habit, but what it does is it allows me to set up these mini happiness habits through the day that can be integrated into my busy life. I mean, I'm sure we all have busy lives, right? But it integrates perfectly into my busy life. And once you start that game, it's very addictive because you see opportunities everywhere. So for me, after each patient, I'll run to the fence and back. Takes 20 seconds, but it gets me outside, gets me moving, stops me from being sedentary. And 15 patients times 30 seconds of jogging a day, it adds up. And for a whole career, that's going to add up to thousands and thousands of hours. So that's how you implement it in a busy life. And once you get it right for a few habits, like I said, it becomes very addictive.
Dr. G, when we went searching high and wide for a specialist in wellbeing in Australia and we came across you and your website, I noticed it says on your vision statement to help make teachers COVID-proof so the health of their mind and body survive lockdowns. I ask you now, for any educators that are out there, how do we get hold of you? Do we just search your website, Atomic Wellbeing?
Yep, so on my website, you can contact me through the inquiry form, or you can email me directly at gihan@atomicwellbeing.com, and I would love the opportunity to help. Like I said, I have a massive soft spot for educators, and it's honestly a dream come true to be of service to them, because looking back at my schooling experience, the impact that certain educators have on my life has literally made me the person I am today. So if I can give back in any way, it would be an absolute honour.
Dr. G, it's been fascinating listening to you today. Really appreciate all your time, and thanks so much for joining us on R J Sanderson TV.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Roy. Appreciate you guys.
Dr. G from Atomic Wellbeing. Roy, some interesting thoughts. I developed an SRS habit a few years ago. I remember back in the day when it was just one stubby that I used to have at night, and now it's blossomed into a fentanyl. I shouldn't.
Dr. G will be proud of you.
I shouldn't go down that path, but no, it was some very valuable information that he gave there, and I think wellbeing a very important topic, and he's obviously a subject matter expert, as was Leah Calnan. It was great to speak to her earlier in the show as well.
It was, and it's great. Dr. G, who does specialise in the education space. I did have a tax question during the week from somebody who was homeschooling. They wanted to know, to help with COVID, homeschooling, stress relief, can they claim red wine? Unfortunately, the answer is no, but it's a good ask.
Geez, there'd be some interesting tax returns if that was the case, if you could. Roy, as always, it's been a pleasure to join you on R J Sanderson TV. Hopefully next time the end of lockdown is on the horizon. According to the roadmap, it will be. So hopefully we'll be talking about more about what the new COVID normal looks like, as opposed to sort of talking about the effect that COVID's had on the pandemic, on the economy, I should say.
I think it's going to be another interesting month. I know we say that almost every month, and they always are interesting months. So we'll see what happens over the next 30 days.
Thanks to our guests on R J Sanderson TV today, and thanks for everyone's company tonight. We appreciate you joining us on R J Sanderson TV.